My name is Eleanor May Brooks. I'm 32 years old, and I live in a narrow row house in South Philadelphia that smells like coffee and old books, where the radiator clanks at night and the paint is forever flaking at the windowsill. I work nights at a hospice intake office. Phones, forms, and the soft business of acknowledging people at their lowest, and during the day I try to sleep, or I walk to the river and watch barges drift by. Right now, I'm restless, fragile in a way that's been accumulating for years like dust at the corners of my life. I have a job that teaches me the language of grief, a brown cardigan that I cling to for warmth, and a calendar on my phone with reminders I set for myself because nobody else will. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. My adoptive parents, Larry and Marianne Brooks, told me when I was 8 that I was meant to be their child. They brought me home from foster care in upstate New York on an oddly warm October afternoon, and my adoption papers smelled faintly of pencil erasures. My sister, Camille, came 4 years later. People always asked if we were blood, and my mother would smile and say, "We're more than blood." I believed it because that's what you do when your chest is hollow and someone fills it with promises. We lived in a brick bungalow with the cracked front steps where leaves gathered in the fall. I remember the smell of Mrs. Brooks's perfume, a heady jasmine that clung to the curtains, and the sound of my father's radio in the garage, tuned to a station that played afternoon talk shows and intermittent baseball. Birthdays at first were cakes from the grocery store and fuzzy candles stuck crookedly into homemade frosting. But somewhere between my 10th and my 20th birthday, the difference in the way they treated Camille and me widened until it was a canyon I couldn't cross. "Happy birthday, Ellie," I learned to say for myself, months before that date, wrapping my own gifts. Small things I scavenged, a pair of thrifted earrings, a paperback I'd been saving for weeks. I learned to make a cake that didn't require help. My parents didn't mean to be cruel. They were selective. It was easier for them to remember the things that fit the life they wanted to show other people. Camille fit it better. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I still remember the first time they forgot. I was 11. I sat at the kitchen table in my pajamas and watched Camille blow out a balloon bouquet that said, "Queen." The phone rang afterwards. My mother answered, giddy, and then turned to me with a face that pretended to be surprised when she saw me. "Oh, Ellie. Did we forget something?" My chest felt like someone had shoved a fist inside it. My father squeezed my shoulder awkwardly and said, "We'll do something this weekend." They never did. From then on, the forgetting became practice. Not always a deliberate erasure, sometimes it was careless, sometimes a competition with the world they wanted to present on Facebook. Photos of Camille in matching outfits, captions like, "Proud mom of my princess," with a heart emoji. I learned how to disappear into the corners of our home so that the omissions wouldn't bruise me too deeply. But silence has a weight. Neglect is a type of violence too. It doesn't leave marks, it leaves absences. They called Camille their miracle. At family dinners she got the leftovers with the best sauce. When someone came to visit, relatives or neighbors, Camille performed the narrative we had been cast in, cheerful, confident, the successful adoptee. My parents would watch her with a kind of gratitude that seemed performative to me, like a couple presenting a perfectly wrapped gift to the world. When the Thanksgiving photos hit the family group chat, her face was at the front of the table every time. I would scroll and feel the small, hot sting of being invisible. That night I started keeping a private journal on my phone, a list of all the times I was left out, all the birthdays they missed. It was a ledger that became an accusation I directed at myself more than at them. I thought maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was spoiled. Maybe if I smiled wider, spoke less, didn't ask for attention, they'd notice me. But erasure is not a reaction to temperament. It is an action. There were other fractures in those years that didn't help. My mother carried a fear of being compared, years of her own childhood smallness, a mother who loved her conditionally. My father had a temper that lived in his jawline, a thing he tried to hide with jokes and kindness toward guests. At family therapy once, a counselor said, "Patterns repeat." It's a sanctimonious statement that somehow made me angrier than it should have. It doesn't feel like wisdom. It feels like fate. My parents' treatment of me echoed the faint way they'd been treated, overlooked, postponed, and I was a convenient vessel for that history. A few months before my 21st birthday, I found an old shoebox under the stairs. Inside were cards and letters addressed to Camille celebrating the gift of your presence, with dates and ribbons. I flipped through them like a thief rifling evidence. There were photographs of Camille's first day of school, of her barreling into the ocean on a summer trip, of her smiling triumphantly at a piano recital. There was one photograph of me too. Me in a hospital gown the day they signed the adoption papers, but it had been tucked behind a stack of Polaroids like an afterthought. I remember the room spinning, the radiator clanking like the tick of a clock, and my hands trembling as if I were about to cough up something I'd been holding in for a lifetime. Why don't they ever throw my parties? I asked Camille once, when we were 15 and sitting on the cracked steps at night, the neighborhood quiet save for an occasional car passing. She chewed on a blade of grass and shrugged, a small, honest thing. Maybe they don't think your birthday is exciting, she said. Maybe they just forget. She didn't know then that forget could be deliberate. She didn't know the stutter of hurt it caused me. I started counting the ways human beings can be absent even when they're physically near. Missed phone calls, eyes sliding past you in a crowded room, plans cancelled with an easy lie. The most brutal absences are orchestrated with smiles and phrases like, "We'll make it up soon," or, "I'm so sorry, sweetie." I began to greet my own birthdays with rituals: a novel at dawn, a walk to the river, a pie I bought from a bakery with a red awning that smelled like butter and sugar. These small traditions kept me alive in the way the life raft of a child keeps a drowning person afloat. Awkward, threadbare, but enough. When I turned 25, I invited 2 close friends to dinner and asked them to pretend it was my parents hosting. We did presents, a candle that barely flickered in my living room, and we toasted with cheap sparkling cider. The hollowness in my throat after they left was so intense I took a cold shower to make myself feel real. It felt unfair, and I knew unfairness was a filter that the rest of the world would not accept as justification for how I felt. So I learned the vocabulary of small satisfactions, the ways we survive when those who should show up don't. Has something like this ever happened to you? Feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. I realize now that being adopted never made me less deserving of birthdays. It only put my worth under a glass dome for my parents to decide how to display. The first part of this story ends with a confession I haven't told them aloud. The forgetting stopped being about missing cake and started being about the messages those omissions sent. My father would say later, in a rare quiet moment, that he didn't notice. My mother would blame a terrible memory. I want to lay the truth here plainly. They knew. Even when they didn't know, they didn't look hard enough to find me. The year I turned 27, my life outside of the house started to feel like a parallel universe where my name meant something different. At the hospice office, people spoke my name with softness, Eleanor May, like it was a talisman. Patients and families offered small slivers of gratitude that made me feel seen in a way my childhood never had. If I scrubbed the soot of my history away, I could almost believe I was someone other than the girl whose birthdays were optional. My sister, Camille, left for graduate school in Boston and became the sort of person people complimented without reservation. She kept her hair long, sent photos of her Boston apartment with sunlight slanting across a wooden floor, and texted our parents pictures of museum trips. Whenever she came home, the house smelled different. Fresh flowers, new shoes, laughter. My parents transformed, sitting up straighter, acting like they hadn't spent 4 years missing my own milestones. They posted photos of Camille with captions that read like confessionals. "My girl is blooming," or "couldn't be prouder." Those posts got likes. My own posts, my birthday selfies, my night shift coffee photos, received polite emojis if anything. There was a summer when everything came to a head. Camille invited me to a small family barbecue in July, the kind where people expect to eat under a canopy and hear the sizzle of burgers on a grill. I arrived early, carrying a store-bought lemon pound cake wrapped in wax paper, my hands sweaty with nerves and the hope of a normal afternoon. The sky had that heavy humidity of a Philadelphia summer, cicadas drowning the air. The grill smoked, neighbors walked dogs, and children ran in circles like a swarm of small moons. "Ellie," my mother called from the yard, and for a moment I thought maybe this time would be different. Maybe they'd set a place, maybe they'd have a small candle tucked into the pound cake, a chorus of "Happy Birthday" that would be real. My father was tinkering with the grill, grease smudged on his forearms. He smiled, but his smile had the architecture of obligation. My sister hugged me with that perfect practiced affection she reserved for strangers and the world. Later, when the sun tilted and people were cleaning plates, my mother pulled me aside. "We tried to make your surprise perfect," she said, voice bright with the guilt of someone defending an absence. "We wanted to give Camille the spotlight today because, well, you know how she is with her program." I swallowed the urge to ask why my birthday had to give way to her program. I felt like a person whose birthday had been rescheduled to accommodate someone else's glory. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps us reach more people. The next weeks felt like the slow unspooling of a frayed rope. I couldn't breathe around the quiet indignity. I could see in Camille's face something like discomfort, a tiny crack of awareness that she was enjoying privileges I had been denied. We argued, more bluntly than we ever had. She accused me of making everything about me. I accused her of not seeing me. Our voices grew loud enough to make the dog in the house whimper. "Why do you always have to bring this up?" she snapped once, folding into herself like she could make me disappear by emotion. "Mom and Dad love you. It's not that big a deal." "It's a big deal to me," I said. "It's my day. It shouldn't disappear because someone else is shiny." She left the room suddenly, retreating to the sanctum where she kept her trophies and diploma frames and clippings about her academic life. I stayed at the kitchen table and watched the clock, the numbers glowing like accusation. After that fight, I started doing something I'd avoided. I asked questions I had been too scared to ask. One evening, in a voice that shook, I demanded to know why our parents seemed to forget my birthdays. My father, who had been tinkering with an old Ford in the garage, came inside wiping his hands. He sat across from me on the threadbare sofa like we were about to discuss the weather. "Eleanor, it's not that we forgot on purpose," he said. "Sometimes things just slip. You're not the only child we've ever had, you know." "But it's always me," I said. "Always. 4 years." My father looked at my hands, which were folded as if in prayer. "Your mother," he started, then stopped, like something was stuck in his mouth. He had the exhausted way of men who have learned to swallow their own shortcomings rather than face them. "We were very careful with Camille when she was younger. There was a time," he paused again, eyes distant, "when her adoption came through, she was smaller. My wife was worried she'd lose her. So we fussed. We celebrated the way people celebrate the thing they fear losing." My breath hitched. "So what you're saying is, you loved her more because you were afraid of losing her?" He didn't answer. He folded his hands and stared at the floor as if reading a script of a guilt he couldn't quite speak. That night I walked to the river. The city smelled like fried food and rain on hot pavement. The water slid by silently, reflective and cold. I felt like every song I had ever loved was playing backward. The realization that their favoritism had something to do with fear, my parents' fear, not mine, didn't make the pain smaller. If anything, it sharpened it into something clearer and more dangerous. Fear, I thought, can be used as an excuse for cruelty. When fear chooses one child to adorn with attention and another to forget, it is still harm. If you're still with me, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. Conversations with my parents became rarer and heavier after that. They'd look at me across the dinner table as if weighing how much truth to give. My mother, who kept bookmarks of long-ago pregnancies and a drawer full of half-finished knitting, began to talk less and correct herself more. She would say, "I'm so sorry," but the words landed like small coins. They made noise but didn't buy me anything. Meanwhile, I built a life outside of them that insisted I mattered. I made friends who knew my birthday and told me I was loved. I learned to accept love from other people in the way someone learns a new language. Clumsily at first, then with growing fluency. And yet at every family gathering, there was that old rhythm. The public praise reserved for Camille, the small talk that circled me like a vulture. My chest tightened, and sometimes in the middle of brushes with happiness I would feel an ambush of emptiness. A birthday unattended by my parents is a wound that reopened with every celebratory photo posted online. When I was 29, a secret came sliding out the way secrets do, wet and raw, from a place we had all tried to keep plastered shut. It started with a faint rumble at the back of our family's history, something I'd always suspected but never had proof of, that Camille's adoption had been handled differently. One afternoon while home for a holiday, I found a stack of hospital bills folded under the photocopied birth certificate of a woman whose signature I did not recognize. The handwriting on one bill was my mother's, and beneath it was a note in her small, neat script. Emergency, no insurance, paid. I sat on the bed and turned the paper in my hands. The familiar sun-streaked room blurred. My heart thudded with the peculiar adrenaline of someone who discovers a trapdoor in their home. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know what lay below. When I confronted my mother that evening, she invited me into the small den and offered a cup of tea that had been cooling. The ceramic cup was chipped at the rim. An old, holding thing. For a long moment she only looked at me. The lines at the corner of her eyes seemed deeper, and the jasmine perfume had the faint undertow of something medicinal. "Eleanor," she said finally, and the name was a tide. "It's complicated. Just tell me," I said. "Please." She breathed in a way that suggested she had been rehearsing. When Camille was born, it was messy. There were complications with the mother, blood loss. The clinic called and said we needed to be there, but because of insurance and paperwork, it would have been weeks before she could be released. I signed the forms to get her out, to get her treated under our name. We paid what we could. We thought. Her voice broke. We thought we'd be saving her. I felt something inside me fold like paper being crushed. "So you arranged everything?" I asked. "You meant to bring her home quickly because you were afraid she might not survive?" My mother nodded, and in her motion there was a confession and an apology wrapped like a bandage. "We were terrified," she said. "I was terrified I'd lose another child. I didn't plan for the consequences." The consequences, of course, included a family narrative that favored Camille, because she had come into their lives while they were at the apex of fear. They had been given a second chance. They celebrated that chance in ways that anchored it in memory. For my parents, I was the calmer, less needy child. I had come to them older, scarred, and because I arrived in a different season, the rituals of saving were never as performed with me. The revelation should have brought a complicated relief, like a bruise identified and labeled. Instead, it added another layer of betrayal. My mother had sacrificed something invisible to her, her capacity to be fair, because she had been too afraid. I forgave her and didn't forgive her in waves like tides. Forgiveness felt like a luxury I wasn't sure I deserved. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that fear was a poor architect of family, but I also wanted to press my cheek against her shoulder and forgive the frightened human in front of me. These conflicting impulses left me humming with nauseous tension. I started seeing a therapist soon after the revelation. Her office smelled like lemon cleaner and new paper. I had a habit of listing grievances aloud in my first session. They always forgot. They celebrated her. They posted pictures. My therapist, Dr. Lane, sat with a quiet that was not the same as nonchalance. "People tend to treat rituals as if they heal the past," she said once. "But they often just reposition it. How do you make them stop hurting?" I asked. "How do you let them be human mistakes without letting them be excuses?" "It's not about making them stop," she said gently. "It's about giving the pain a boundary. Letting it exist without letting it take over the whole room." Those therapy sessions were small acts of rebellion. They taught me the vocabulary of boundaries and the radical possibility that I could claim my own rituals without waiting for permission. I began to host my own birthday dinners. I invited people who showed up for more than my curated photos. I learned how to expect less from my parents and more from myself. These were not grand changes. They were adjustments like tightening a shoelace so your shoe doesn't slip. Yet something else was moving in the house. Camille, who had been a kind of sun in my parents' orbit, got engaged. Her fiancé, James, was polite and steady and loved museums in a way that made my parents beam. The wedding planning activated the same machinery of adoration that had always been reserved for Camille. My mother called and started making guest lists and talking about flower colors with the kind of warmth reserved for shows on television. I felt the old hunger return. To be the recipient of ritual, to be seen in the particular way that only my family could make me feel. But I had learned to put a shelf between my chest and the world. I could see the hunger. I could offer it bread without expecting it to fill me. One evening, my sister and I had a rare conversation that cut through the patina of performance. We were sitting in her attic room in Cambridge during a visit. The place smelled of dust and coffee grounds, and she was softer than usual, her defenses dangling like a sweater with a missing button. "Do you remember when you used to wake me up for my birthday?" she said suddenly. "You used to bring me a slice of cake in bed when we were kids. I used to hate it." "I remember," I said. "I remember the frosting on your nose." "I didn't know it hurt you," she whispered. "I thought you did it because you loved me." "I did do it because I loved you," I said. "But they never did that for me." We sat in the awkwardness of that sentence like two people holding a hot iron. "I'm sorry," she said again, "for what they did." Her apology wasn't the end. It wasn't even a turning point. But it was honest. It was the sort of thing that could loosen the knot of resentment between us if we were willing to work on it. I realized then that wounds between siblings are complicated by external worship. Sometimes the person you resent for having more is also the person who carries their own burdens. Sympathy, I found, doesn't erase pain, it reframes it. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps. That winter, Camille's wedding approached like a strange holiday. Mom and Dad were glowing in the way people do when they're part of a story that has been vindicated. They asked me to stand at the rehearsal dinner, and I said yes, because declining felt like confessing a grievance publicly. Standing there, next to my sister in a dress that reeked of newness, I felt transported from one life to another. People smiled and tuffed the surface of me as if checking whether I was the broody sibling they'd heard about. At the reception, my parents gave a speech that praised family and sacrifice, and used the word miracle 3 times. I listened and felt the old ache, but also something else. A strange resilience. The years of being overlooked had taught me to make my own meaning and to build small altars where none existed. My celebration of another kind, quiet, unbroadcast, rich with intention, was growing in the shadow of a louder performance. After the wedding, the house settled into its new normal, which meant staged visits full of cameras and guests and then long stretches of ordinary neglect. Their show of devotion to Camille became a pattern that returned intermittently, like a seasonal bloom. For me, the internal work continued. Therapy, small rituals, a broader circle of people who witnessed me. But there were moments that cut through like glass shards. A birthday text hours late with the words, "Happy belated birthday," and a heart emoji, a Facebook story starring Camille's latest accolades. The life I had made of coping sometimes felt like a fragile tent in the wind, and every reminder of my parents' favoritism threatened to collapse it. One summer night, 2 years after the wedding, my father had a heart attack. It happened while he was mowing the lawn. The machine held steady as if his body had simply decided to stop moving. The sirens were a sound I will never forget, metal and urgency and people running. In the hospital waiting room, my mother and Camille and I sat like 3 islands in a sea that might swallow us all. The fluorescent lights made everyone look too honest. My father's chest was a landscape of bandages and bleeping monitors, his face waxen and small. Everything I had felt for years condensed into a single, flickering terror. I realized in that room, sudden and electric, that the people who had hurt me were still my people. The rawness of that feeling was almost unbearable. I found myself arranging flowers in the plastic vase beside his bed, hoping that something I could do would counterbalance the harm. My mother took my hand at one point and squeezed it, hard enough to hurt. "Eleanor," she said, leaning toward me as if confessing a prayer, Nothing matters without family. I thought of all the birthdays they had forgotten, of ways small and accumulating that they had taught me I mattered less. But the thought came with another. Families are messy, and what we call family is sometimes the only axis we have. I folded the contradiction in my chest and carried it with me. My father's recovery was slow. The doctors suggested lifestyle changes they could outline in thick pamphlets and heavy words. Heart failure, risk, prevention. My mother was changed, in a way that wasn't just for show. She called me more, asked for help with simple things, and offered apologies that sounded less like rehearsed lines and more like real attempts at repair. She cooked dinner for me once and brought a piece of lemon pound cake with the faintest shaving of a new frosting. The gesture was small, but it felt like a pebble thrown into a pond. The ripples were wide. One night, months after the heart attack, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table with a small lamp lighting our faces. The house smelled like boiled vegetables and the air carried a low hum of the refrigerator. We spoke in whispers as if we were trying not to wake something. "Eleanor," she said, "I have to tell you something I never told you before." I braced myself. For years I had built my armor out of preparedness. Each time I perceived an omission I tried to lean into the strength it demanded. The admission she made after a pause shook me more than I expected. "When you were a baby," she said, "there was a time when I wanted to give you my attention in the same way. I tried. But it was different. You were older when we adopted you, and we were different people. We were changed. I thought we could be fair, but fear." She stopped, and I could see the outline of a woman who had been small most of her life. Fear kept us from being even. There was a long silence. I thought of all the birthdays, of the pound cake, of the shredded ledger on my phone. The tilt of the world felt subtly altered by her confession, not because it excused anything, but because it humanized it in a way that allowed me to change my response. "I forgive you," I said quietly, and the words tasted like medicine, bitter and necessary. It didn't mean bliss or erasure. It meant I could stop carrying the weight as if it were the only thing I was allowed to hold about them. Forgiveness became the most private of choices, not for their absolution but for my own peace. After that, our relationship shifted slowly, like a gear turning in a machine that has rusted but still moves. We ate dinners together more often. My mother stopped posting the same performative photos and started sending me articles she thought I'd like, small gestures that signaled a willingness to change. She still forgot a few times, small, merciful times, but the forgetting lost some of its cruelty. My father took to calling me on my shift and asking about people's latest stories at the hospice. He laughed with me about absurd television shows, and those moments felt like windows. But not everything healed. My father never fully stepped out of his pattern of doing more for Camille. There were still moments of rawness, photos that made my chest tighten, gestures that slid past me. Yet the presence of small, thoughtful acts from my parents softened the edges. I began to accept that family could be flawed and still partial to repair. The most unexpected change came from Camille. She began to ask me for help more, to reach out for the kinds of small kindnesses I used to offer her in childhood. She called me the night she miscarried, voice broken and small. I held the phone and listened and offered a tenderness for which there was no script. We were both raw. In that moment, I realized that suffering doesn't adhere to hierarchy. Pain is not a contest. Her loss did not erase my losses, and mine did not negate hers. We were complicated, and together we were human. Has something like this ever happened to you? If it has, I'm reading every comment. Your stories matter. My healing was not dramatic. There were no cinematic confrontations, no big "we're sorry" headlines. It was a series of ordinary days in which we practiced being kinder, where apologies were made and sometimes carried through. I learned to ask for what I needed, to host my own rituals, to say my name aloud and believe it. In the end, the most profound change was internal. I stopped asking my parents to do for me what they couldn't give, and I started giving to myself what I needed. It was not easy. It was not complete. But it was mine. Years passed and the habits we create become the landmarks of our lives. I settled into a rhythm that involved both distance and connection. regular Sunday calls with my mother, Thanksgiving dinners where everyone tried to avoid the old landmines, and quiet mornings when I would make myself a birthday ritual that involved a walk to the Delaware River, a slice of cake from the corner bakery, and a notebook where I wrote letters to myself. On the morning of my 32nd birthday, the sky was soft and gray. Snow had dusted the sidewalk overnight, and the air had that peculiar, clean sting that makes lungs feel new. I made coffee, wrapped a small book with brown paper, and walked to the park. The city was slow that day, like it had been carved out for reflection. I sat on a bench with my coat pulled tight and watched joggers pass and a couple argue quietly on the far path. Around me, the world hummed with lives that were continuing whether I felt acknowledged or not. I had a small faith that every birthday I lived to see was a victory. This victory was not dramatic, no horns, no confetti, but it was real. I had survived neglect, learned to lay down boundaries, and built meaningful relationships that were not contingent on performative displays. I had, in many ways, become the person I wanted to be. If you're into stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, there's more to come. That afternoon my mother called. She had been softer lately, but there was that old, all too familiar rhythm in her voice. Performance with a trace of sincerity. "We're coming over," she said. "We brought lunch." For a moment I thought of refusing, of closing my door and lighting a candle alone. But when the knock came at noon and the door opened to my parents' faces, there was a sincerity there that made me catch my breath. My father looked small in a sweater, his hair flecked with gray, and my mother held a plastic bag with containers of casserole and a little boxed cake with a single candle stuck in it like an afterthought. The cake was store-bought and modest. My father coughed and said, "We, didn't want to make a scene. We wanted to be here." I looked at my parents, then at the small cake. For a minute I held all my old grievances like instruments, measurements of how much pain they had caused. But instead of weighing them against one another, I set them down. The practical part of me noted the gesture for what it was. Imperfect, late, maybe motivated by vulnerability. The tender part of me allowed gratitude to enter. "We got each other gifts last week," my mother said, a little awkward. "We thought this would be a quiet thing." We sat and ate. There were pauses and small questions. My father told a clumsy story about a television show, and my mother asked about my job in a way that sounded as if she meant it. When the candle was lit, one of the neighbors, a woman who had lived below us for years, joined in for the song, and for a moment I felt like we were participating in a small, ordinary miracle. "Happy birthday, Ellie," my mother said, and I believed her. After they left, the house felt like it always had, full of echoes and small possessions, but something about the departure was different. I stood in my living room and looked at the little cake in the trash bin and felt a gratitude that was shockingly large. Healing, I realized, was not an event but a practice. It requires allowing new things into the space old hurts occupy, like placing a plant in a room that once held a locked box. In the months that followed, my parents continued to forget sometimes. Old habits have long half-lives. But the forgetting lost some of its corrosive power. My parents apologized more often, and when they couldn't find the right words, they tried small acts of attention, a card in the mail, a surprise visit with my favorite cookies, an inexplicable text in the middle of a Wednesday that said, simply, "Thinking of you." I still keep the ledger on my phone, but now its pages contain not just grievances but also gifts. Moments where people surprised me with kindness, where I surprised myself with endurance. I learned that people are messy and, sometimes, capable of change. I learned to ask for what I needed and to build rituals I controlled. Most importantly, I learned that my worth didn't hinge on whether the people who raised me could see it. If this has resonated, please drop a comment. Your story could matter to someone else. The final and perhaps most intimate lesson I want to leave is this. Families are mirrors, but mirrors distort. They reflect not just your face but the light hitting them. My adoptive parents forgot my birthday again and again, and those omissions shaped me in ways both terrible and instructive. They taught me to be resilient, to audit my worth, and to insist on being seen. If it taught me anything, it is that the only thing we can truly promise to our own hearts is the commitment to show up for ourselves. The world will not always do it for us, sometimes we have to do the showing. I don't end this story with a tidy bow. There are still nights when the absence of a candle left in my memory burns. There are still moments I want to reclaim. But there is also the warmth of a candle I light for myself, one I tend carefully, one that I protect. That candle has a soft glow, and on my birthdays now, I sing softly to myself before I go to sleep. It is not a loud song. It doesn't need to be. It is enough.